The U.S. Capitol rotunda pulsed with polished power, marble floors echoing the shoes of senators, the hum of security devices, the flash of press cameras. It wasn't a day for ceremonies or votes. It was a summit. One the world hadn't expected. Vice President Kamala Harris entered first, flanked by aides and guarded by an air of practiced authority. Her smile was tight, calculated. She glanced across the room at the tall figure standing calmly, arms behind his back. Ibrahim Traoré, the military leader of Burkina Faso, stood in a traditional West African tunic, unflinching under the American gaze. The invitation was controversial. A dozen networks aired it live, while analysts debated, why invite a revolutionary soldier from Africa into the American seat of democracy? Kamala approached with the practiced grace of a prosecutor. Her heels clicked like a gavel. "Mr. Traoré," she said with a nod. "Let's speak honestly." He returned the nod. "That's the only language I speak here." A small audience, lawmakers, advisors, journalists, shifted forward in their chairs. Kamala began, voice calm but pointed. "Your words carry weight, Captain. But they're dangerous. You've emboldened uprisings. You've shaken alliances. Do you understand what you're igniting?" Traoré's expression didn't change. His voice cut through the room like a blade of ice. "Dangerous? Truth is always dangerous, to those who build empires on lies." Gasps from the audience. Cameras zoomed in. Kamala's smile faltered for half a second. "You speak of truth," she said, voice tighter now, "yet you align with nations that silence others. You stir the streets while we try to stabilize them." Traoré leaned forward. "You don't stabilize. You suffocate. You call resistance chaos. You call silence peace. But peace built on the graves of children is not peace. It's cowardice." A beat of stunned silence. Even Kamala blinked, caught off guard. "Are you accusing us?" "I'm stating what the world already knows. You asked who I fight for. I fight for the buried voices you refuse to hear." The rotunda was no longer a symbol of order. It had become a courtroom, and the witness was shaking the judge. The headlines would write themselves. But Traoré didn't speak for headlines. He spoke for the dead. Kamala Harris leaned forward, her voice sharp yet composed. "Your words are dangerous, Mr. Traoré." The chamber hushed. Eyes turned. Cameras zoomed in. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked calmly to the podium, his boots echoing across marble like war drums. He didn't look at the press. He didn't glance at the senators. He stared directly at Kamala. "No," he said, voice low but cutting through the silence like a blade. "What you fear is not danger. What you fear is truth." The room stilled, caught between disbelief and discomfort. Traoré took a breath and continued. "When children in Gaza scream under rubble, your statements are silent. When minds are emptied in Africa, your corporations are loud. So tell me, who is truly dangerous?" Kamala sat frozen. It wasn't the first time she had been challenged. But this wasn't a protester to be dismissed or a diplomat to be placated. This was a man who carried the grief of a continent and the fury of the unheard. His words didn't aim to offend, they aimed to expose. "America claims to protect order," Traoré said. "But your order means silence for the oppressed and microphones for the powerful. It means weapons for dictators and lectures for the free." Gasps scattered through the audience. A few foreign delegates looked down. One UN interpreter paused mid-sentence, stunned. Traoré leaned in. "We've been labeled unstable, uneducated, uncivilized. But the truth is, your stability is built on our suffering, and your education hides our erasure. So if truth is dangerous, then let it burn through every lie in this hall." Kamala blinked, her jaw tight. For once, the vice president had no words, and Traoré wasn't done. "You call me dangerous because I speak without permission. But let me be clear, I don't need your permission. I stand here not because of your approval, but despite your oppression." A murmur of applause began, quiet at first, then louder. Even some of the American journalists couldn't help but nod. Truth, it turned out, wasn't just dangerous. It was contagious. The chamber still trembled with the echo of applause as Traoré stood firm, his hands resting lightly on the podium, an unshaken pillar amid a sea of political discomfort. Kamala Harris straightened her papers, trying to summon the polished calm of a stateswoman, but her fingers trembled ever so slightly. She had faced presidents, senators, generals, but never a voice so raw, so defiant, so immune to protocol. Traoré tilted his head slightly. "You speak of democracy," he said, eyes narrowing, "but you fear voices that are not yours." A ripple moved across the room, part recognition, part guilt. A few diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered to aides. The Israeli ambassador scowled. A French delegate removed his earpiece. "Let me ask you," Traoré continued, walking down from the podium and into the crowd like a man among witnesses. "When Gaza is burning, where is your humanity? When Africa bleeds, where is your press? When silence becomes policy, is that not complicity?" He stopped beside the American delegation. "You ban books, but send bombs. You cancel artists, but fund airstrikes. And you dare ask me about danger?" Kamala's gaze met his, but this time it wasn't authority, it was a plea for control. Traoré offered no such comfort. He turned slowly and addressed the entire assembly. "Let it be known, I am not here to ask for aid. I am not here to negotiate dignity. I am here to remind you, what you silence, the world remembers." A journalist dropped his pen. "You built your peace on stolen bones," Traoré said. "But bones do not forget. And neither do the people." This time, no one applauded. They simply listened. And that, perhaps, was louder than any clapping. A heavy, expectant silence hung in the air like smoke after a battlefield volley. Kamala Harris shifted in her seat, her smile replaced by something tighter, less certain. Across the room, world leaders avoided each other's eyes, unsure of whether to clap or condemn. The UN floor had heard thousands of speeches before, but none had ignited this kind of raw, unsettling reflection. Ibrahim Traoré returned to the stage with deliberate steps, not to escalate, but to deepen the wound already opened. "You fear the truth," he said, voice steady, words landing like stones. "Because truth ruins your illusion of moral high ground. You use words like freedom, but your hands still carry the chains of another man's gold. You speak of stability, but it's built on the backs of the silenced." He turned to face Kamala directly. "Madam Vice President, when you call my words dangerous, what you really mean is they are inconvenient. You fear not for the world, but for the lie that keeps your power in place." Kamala's lips parted, perhaps to respond, but the room was not hers now. "You think a black man with a gun is dangerous?" Traoré asked. "Try a black man with the microphone. That's what terrifies you." Cameras zoomed in. Phones were lifted discreetly. Across the world, screens flickered to life as live broadcasts were interrupted to carry the unexpected firestorm from the UN. "Truth is dangerous," Traoré said, "because it can't be bought. It doesn't run for office. It doesn't wear a flag. It simply is." He looked out toward the press rows. "And if speaking it costs me your approval, your alliance, or even my life, I accept that price." People leaned forward. Even those who disagreed could no longer look away, because truth doesn't need permission, it just needs a voice. And in that moment, everyone knew. They were no longer listening to a speech, they were witnessing a warning. Kamala Harris stood in front of a wall of flags at the Georgetown Policy Forum, surrounded by staffers who whispered strategies into her ear. She had just finished delivering a carefully curated speech on global information responsibility when the moderator turned to Traoré, who had remained quiet, watching, calculating. Kamala tried to keep the upper hand. "Mr. Traoré," she began, her tone condescending, "you speak with passion, yes. But don't you worry that your rhetoric stirs division? That it ignites chaos?" The room hushed. The trap was laid. Traoré leaned forward, his voice steady. "Madam Vice President, the truth does not ignite chaos, oppression does. Silence is your weapon. Mine is clarity." She tried again. "Words are weapons. They can turn peaceful protest into violent revolution." Traoré didn't blink. Peaceful protest becomes revolution only when the powerful stop listening. You don't fear my words because they're dangerous, you fear them because they are heard. That hit the marrow. Suddenly, a journalist stood up. President Traoré, can you confirm reports that African states are planning to cut U.S. media access? The timing was no accident. Traoré straightened. What the media calls cutting access, we call reclaiming our narrative. We've lived for decades under a broadcast empire that told our story through your lens. Now, we speak for ourselves. Kamala narrowed her eyes. So, your answer to misinformation is censorship? Traoré turned to her slowly. No, madam. Our answer to misinformation is sovereignty. You cloak propaganda in press freedom. But when my people die under your sanctioned bombs, silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. The moderator tried to change the subject, but the shift had already happened. Across social media, Traoré's quotes began to trend. People from Brazil to Berlin were reposting his words with hashtags like #VoiceOfTheGlobalSouth and #TraoréSpeaksTruth. In that moment, it wasn't Kamala's speech or America's warnings that the world remembered, it was Traoré's voice, rising from a continent they tried to quiet, now roaring across the planet like a storm no one could stop. And for Kamala, the real danger wasn't his words. It was the world finally listening. Kamala Harris returned to her private lounge, visibly rattled. The applause for Traoré still echoed down the marble corridors of the international summit. Her aides surrounded her, tossing talking points like lifelines. But none of them could rewrite what had just happened. A man from a land they'd labeled undeveloped had just outmaneuvered the entire Western script. Meanwhile, in a side hall crowded with diplomats and press, Traoré stood calm, but alert. He'd learned long ago, after the French coup plots, the sanctions, the threats, that the battle wasn't just with bullets. It was with perception. And that was the battlefield he now dominated. A low voice came from behind. That was quite a performance. Kamala had re-entered the hall alone. No entourage. Just anger behind a diplomatic smile. Traoré turned. You call it performance. I call it truth. Kamala stepped closer, her voice low and sharp. You think you're some kind of revolutionary? You're just the latest pawn. The world moves when Washington says so. He smiled slightly. And yet here you are, cornered. Alone. Kamala's eyes flared for the briefest second. The polished poise cracked. You're playing a dangerous game, she hissed. So were the colonizers, Traoré answered. Didn't end well for them either. In that charged silence, a photographer's flash accidentally lit the moment. Kamala's face twisted in restrained fury, Traoré's calm defiance etched in shadow and light. The image would soon go viral, not because it was posed, but because it was real. Hours later, mainstream networks attempted damage control, calling Traoré controversial and uninformed. But it was too late. The video had spread across TikTok and X, translated into dozens of languages. African youth began posting their own responses under the hashtag #FearMeThen, quoting Traoré's line from earlier. You called me a threat to order. Then fear me. The narrative was no longer in Washington's control. Kamala Harris had walked into that summit believing she would outclass him with polish, pedigree, and press power. Instead, she walked out realizing the world was listening to a different voice now. And that voice didn't need permission. The summit was over. But what happened inside hadn't stayed there. The confrontation between Traoré and Kamala Harris had already flooded the streets, from Accra to Atlanta, Nairobi to New York. It wasn't just a political clash anymore, it had become a global moment. In Harlem, a crowd had gathered under the bright lights of a corner cafe, watching the clip of Traoré's words on a loop. A local activist, microphone in hand, repeated his line, "You called me a threat to order. Then fear me." Cheers erupted. In Dakar, university students held debates not about Harris's speech, but about the line Traoré had drawn in the sand. They no longer discussed whether Africa should integrate with the West, but how to break free from it. Economically, culturally, spiritually. Meanwhile, Kamala's team worked overtime. Damage control memos flooded the White House. The official narrative painted Traoré as provocative, uninformed, even dangerous. But none of it stuck. Because people weren't listening to Washington anymore. They were watching Traoré. And then, something unexpected happened. A renowned political cartoonist released an image, Harris sitting on a crumbling throne labeled Order, and Traoré rising from a battlefield with a voice made of flames. The caption read, "You feared the fire, because you lit the match." It went viral in under 2 hours. In the middle of this storm, Traoré returned to Burkina Faso. He didn't throw press conferences. He didn't boast. Instead, he went to a school under construction in a rural village and spoke to children about what it meant to speak truth even when it hurt. A 10-year-old girl raised her hand. "Will they try to silence you?" He looked at her and said, "Maybe. But only if they're afraid. And fear is proof we're winning." The image of that moment, Traoré crouched to eye level with that little girl, hand over heart, would become another symbol. The media couldn't spin it. The world wouldn't ignore it. By the end of the week, international headlines began to shift. No longer was Traoré simply Burkina Faso's leader. Now, they labeled him something new. The voice they tried to bury. And with every attempt to dismiss him, his voice grew louder. By the time Kamala Harris returned to Washington, the political climate had shifted. Traoré wasn't just a name echoing in activist circles, he was now a symbol, a disruption, a thorn in the spine of American diplomacy. And that made her dangerous. Not because she had defeated him, but because she hadn't. During a closed-door intelligence briefing, Harris snapped. "He's becoming a martyr," she said. "Not because he died, but because he dared." A senior advisor cleared his throat. "Madam Vice President, respectfully, he dared, and the world listened." In a quiet room inside the Pentagon, generals discussed African airspace not in terms of geography, but influence. Traoré's voice had pierced through barriers that bombs could never reach. It had ignited something in the hearts of people who had long been told to stay silent. In Uganda, street artists painted murals of him with quotes not from speeches, but moments, unscripted flashes of clarity. "If your order means silence, then I'll choose chaos with truth. I wasn't born to whisper." Meanwhile, Kamala was advised to issue a controlled statement to repair the optics. A speech was drafted, sterilized by public relations, tested on focus groups. It read, "We respect all voices of leadership. But reckless words only stoke the fires of instability." But when it aired, it felt hollow. Plastic. Programmed. Like an echo chamber speaking only to itself. Across the Atlantic, Traoré released no speech. Instead, he released footage, unedited, raw, of Gaza hospitals with no power, of children buried under rubble, of silence broken only by the sound of grief. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. He let the world feel the consequences of order. It was a different kind of warfare, conscience versus protocol. And while the West clung to diplomacy as performance, Traoré turned every wound into a microphone. In the UN corridors, whispers grew louder. Diplomats who once rolled their eyes now leaned in. Even those who disagreed with his methods couldn't ignore his message. Something rare was happening. A leader was speaking from the wound, not from the podium. And suddenly, Kamala's camp faced the worst kind of opponent, one who refused to play by their rules, yet still won hearts without asking permission. Because when silence becomes surrender, a voice like Traoré's doesn't just echo. It roars. Kamala Harris stood behind the polished podium of the White House press room. Cameras flashed. The air was thick with tension, not just from the media frenzy, but from the rising pressure of a narrative they could no longer control. Her voice, confident yet carefully measured, rang out. Traoré's words, dangerous, divisive, destabilizing, may sound noble, but they are a threat to the fragile balance we've worked so hard to protect. She paused, waiting for applause. None came. Somewhere across the ocean, Traoré stood before a sea of young faces in Bamako. No notes. No teleprompter. Just conviction. They call truth dangerous when it threatens their lies. They call resistance divisive when it unites the oppressed. The crowd didn't cheer, they roared. This wasn't a campaign. It was a reckoning. Satellite footage of Gaza played side by side on global media, American officials offering carefully curated statements, while Traoré posted unfiltered clips of bombed-out schools and weeping mothers. The contrast was undeniable, and it was viral. In Washington, Kamala's advisors panicked. "He's hijacking the global narrative," one whispered. "No," another corrected, "he's reclaiming it." Behind closed doors, policymakers asked dangerous questions. What if Traoré wasn't the radical? What if he was just the mirror? An emergency summit was proposed. Harris offered a public invitation. Let's sit down and discuss peace, responsibility, and leadership. Traoré's response came not in words, but in action. He arrived at a refugee camp, knee-deep in mud, holding a dying child's hand. Cameras didn't follow him there. Pain did. To the West, leadership meant press briefings and economic leverage. To Traoré, it meant bleeding with the wounded. Global youth began printing shirts with his face, not airbrushed, but raw, with his famous reply etched below. "If the truth makes you fear me, then fear is the price of your denial." His influence wasn't just political, it was moral. And the more the White House tried to paint him as a threat, the more authentic he became. Kamala once warned, his words are dangerous. But now, even she knew. His silence would have been even more deadly. And as the UN prepared for another session, the world waited not for America's policy, but for Traoré's next sentence. The United Nations Hall was silent. Not the kind of silence that follows a speech, but the kind that precedes a storm. Kamala Harris sat poised, her hands clasped tightly, her advisors still murmuring behind her. She had spoken first, calm, diplomatic, scripted. Her message? We seek peace. We urge restraint. We will lead. But no one remembered her words. Because Ibrahim Traoré was about to speak. He didn't rise immediately. He let the weight of the moment sink into every chair, every camera lens, every trembling voice in the room. Then, slowly, he stood. No podium. No paper. No flag behind him. Just a man, tired, unflinching, and ready. Peace? You want peace, he said, voice steady. Then stop feeding the war. Somewhere, a Western diplomat shifted in his seat. You sit here and speak of order, of diplomacy, of leadership. But your bombs scream louder than your words. A few officials turned away. Some stared at their shoes. Others simply froze. You say my words are dangerous. That I provoke unrest. That I challenge the West. He stepped forward. Good. Silence again. Because I refuse to let your silence bury our dead. I refuse to let your comfort erase their names. On a giant screen behind him, Traoré played a short video, footage of a child in Gaza, holding a blood-stained notebook. No narration. No music. Just the truth. And it crushed the room. Kamala tried to interject, but Traoré raised a hand, not to silence her, but to finish. You call yourselves leaders? Then act like it. Don't lead from podiums. Lead from graves. From hunger. From shame. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I am not afraid of your titles. I am not afraid of your wealth. I am not afraid of your allies. Then he looked straight at Kamala. Straight at the cameras. Straight at the world. I am only afraid that I say too little, too late. And with that, he stepped away, not seeking applause, not needing validation. The chamber didn't erupt. It stood still. For a moment, the UN felt smaller than the child in the video. Smaller than the truth Traoré had spoken. And as the world replayed his words across every screen, in every language, one message echoed louder than all. Truth doesn't need permission to speak. It only needs someone brave enough to carry it. And that someone, today, was Ibrahim Traoré.